The film opens in shadow. A woman's scream echoes across a plantation field, then falls silent. The screen cuts to black as the narrator speaks, low and deliberate. In the archives of forgotten America, there lies a story too obscene for textbooks, too corrosive for sermons, and too dangerous for memory. A story of a colonel, his wife, and 7 enslaved men, bound together in an agreement that would not only destroy a dynasty, but curse a town for generations. Tonight, we descend into that silence. The camera drifts over a decaying southern manor, its wood bleached by a century of sun and rot. Once, it was alive with carriages, banquets, and the whip-crack discipline of Colonel Nathaniel Harridge, a war veteran and landowner who built his fortune on cotton and cruelty. His wife, Eleanor, was whispered about even in her own time. Beautiful, intelligent, and restless, she carried within her a loneliness no luxury could cure. The marriage was cold, a union forged in politics and land rather than love. Servants spoke of late-night walks by the river, of candlelit rooms where Eleanor stared at her reflection, whispering to herself, as though rehearsing for something unspeakable. What history refuses to hold on to is the night in 1823 when Colonel Harridge proposed an arrangement, one so twisted it blurred the lines between domination and surrender. He gathered 7 enslaved men from his fields, men who had borne his lash, men who carried his scars. In the stillness of the dining hall, he declared that Eleanor was no longer his wife alone, but theirs as well. He wrote it into a contract, sealed in ink and blood. Witnesses swore the colonel claimed it would bind their obedience forever, break the spirit of rebellion by giving them a piece of what no master would ever dare offer. In whispers, locals would later call it the Ceremony of 7. Behind locked doors, Eleanor was brought into the grand bedroom, its canopy bed draped with crimson fabric, its air suffocating with jasmine and sweat. She trembled as each man stepped forward, not as property this time, but as part of an unholy covenant. The walls absorbed their cries, their weeping, their silence. Some accounts insist Eleanor was drugged with laudanum. Others suggest she went willingly, her body both weapon and offering. By dawn, a pact older than paper had been sealed, not in law, but in flesh. What happened inside the Harridge estate spread only in rumor. Church sermons hinted at the sin of Babylon, while plantation wives gossiped in private about Eleanor's haunted eyes. Slaves on other estates whispered of rebellion. If a colonel could hand his wife to his slaves, what else could be overturned? Yet no uprising came. Instead, a silence took root. The men returned to their fields, Eleanor to her chambers, the colonel to his ledger books. But something had shifted. The air itself seemed poisoned. The plantation dogs grew vicious, refusing to sleep indoors. Children in the nearby town spoke of shadows moving across the Harridge windows long after the family had gone to bed. 2 years later, an orphanage was built on the Harridge land, funded by the colonel's wealth. Officially, it was a charitable act, a way to redeem his name in the eyes of the church. But the children who lived there spoke decades later of night terrors, of being summoned into the mansion's cellar where the walls smelled of iron and decay. They recalled Eleanor standing in white gowns, silent, while the colonel muttered prayers in a language no one recognized. The orphans would wake with scratches across their backs, bruises in the shape of hands too large for their own small frames. Eleanor's decline was rapid and violent. Neighbors claimed she wandered the cotton fields at night, barefoot and covered in mud, whispering the names of the 7 men over and over like a litany. When confronted, she said she was not calling them, but answering. Her diary, discovered years later, contained drawings of 7 interlocking circles, a woman at the center, and passages written backward that scholars still cannot fully translate. The handwriting grew frantic, words carved into paper as though the pen were a blade. One entry read simply, "The agreement was never his to make. They are mine now." In 1826, the first disappearance occurred. A visiting preacher vanished after giving a sermon at the Harridge plantation. His horse was found wandering near the river, its saddle torn. Weeks later, children swore they saw a man hanging upside down in the trees near the orphanage, his mouth sewn shut with black thread. No body was ever recovered. The colonel dismissed it as hysteria, but whispers spread that the 7 men, bound by the pact, were exacting revenge in ways no one could witness. The local church, fearful of scandal, issued no condemnation. Instead, ministers insisted that obedience to earthly authority was obedience to God, that rumors of witchcraft and rebellion were the devil's temptation. Behind closed doors, however, letters circulated among clergy, letters that spoke of Eleanor's possession, of rituals performed in the mansion basement, of blood sacrifices involving orphan children. None of these claims were made public for fear of collapsing the fragile order of plantation society. By the 1830s, the Harridge fortune began to collapse. Crops rotted in the field, traders avoided their contracts, and the family name became poison. Eleanor bore no children, though she claimed to hear voices calling her mother. The colonel drank himself into rage and ruin, beating both slaves and servants with increasing cruelty. But the strangest truth of all was this: the 7 men to whom Eleanor had been given never attempted escape. Even after opportunities arose, they remained on the estate, their eyes hollow, their bodies marked by unseen forces. The orphanage burned to the ground in 1834. Dozens of children perished in their sleep. Witnesses swore they saw Eleanor standing at a window as flames consumed the structure, her white gown glowing like a specter. The colonel claimed it was an accident, caused by careless candles. But survivors, scarred and broken, told of shadows moving through the dormitories, of doors locked from the outside, of whispers urging them to lie still. The nearby town of Stovemount fell under a pall of fear. Merchants refused to discuss the Harridge family, but they continued to sell them supplies. Ministers refused to speak against them, but they accepted donations. Parents warned their children never to go near the Harridge estate, yet laborers kept working the fields. Everyone knew, but no one acted. The silence itself became a curse, as though the town had entered into its own pact by refusing to confront the horror in their midst. In 1837, Colonel Harridge was found dead in his study, his body contorted, his face frozen in a grimace of terror. His tongue had been severed and nailed to the desk with an iron spike. On the wall above him, written in his own blood, were the words, "It was never yours." No one was ever charged. Eleanor wore black for a single day, then began hosting gatherings in the mansion, lavish dinners where she sat at the head of the table with 7 empty chairs placed beside her. Guests at Eleanor's dinners spoke of shadows that seemed to move independently of candlelight. Some swore they felt hands on their shoulders, though no one stood behind them. Eleanor referred to her husbands, claiming they were always present, always watching. By then, the 7 enslaved men had vanished. Their names disappeared from plantation ledgers. Their cabins stood empty. Yet Eleanor insisted they had not left. They had become something else. Long after Eleanor's death in 1849, the Harridge estate fell into ruin. Families who purchased the land reported madness, violence, and stillbirths. Children born on the soil were said to carry the mark of the 7 circles, a birthmark that spread across their chest like rings of a tree. Local legends claimed the soil itself rejected crops, as though poisoned by a covenant that could not be broken. In 1912, a box of Harridge papers was unearthed in a church cellar. Contained within were the colonel's original contract, signed in blood, and Eleanor's diary. The church quietly burned most of the material, but a few fragments survived. Among them, a sketch of a woman with 7 arms reaching from her ribs, her face split in half, one side serene, the other skeletal. Scholars who studied the fragments reported night terrors, hallucinations, and eventual nervous collapse. During the 1930s, a seminary attempted to reclaim the Harridge land for missionary use. Students reported doors slamming in abandoned buildings, disembodied voices chanting, and visions of a woman walking barefoot through the fields. One student disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a note that read, "I married her." The seminary abandoned the project within a year, claiming the soil was unsuitable. Psychologists who studied the Harridge legend in the 1940s noted how quickly rational men and women succumbed to irrational fear when exposed to its details. Even skeptics who dismissed the story found themselves dreaming of Eleanor, always standing at the edge of the bed, always whispering. It was never his to give. Case studies documented nervous breakdowns, suicides, and unexplained disappearances among researchers. The legend had moved beyond folklore. It had become a psychological contagion. Official histories of the region omit the Harridge family almost entirely. The plantation records were destroyed, the orphanage erased, the church archives sealed. To this day, descendants of Stovemount refuse to speak of the dynasty. Silence has become the only form of survival. Yet silence is its own testimony, louder than any confession. For what kind of memory must be buried so completely, unless it threatens to devour the living? The narrator's voice deepens as the camera pulls back from the ruins of the Harridge estate. The sky darkens, cicadas scream, and the screen fades to black. The colonel believed he could master obedience by giving his wife to 7 slaves. But what he gave was not obedience. It was power, ancient and uncontainable. It destroyed his dynasty, consumed his wife, and cursed his town. And perhaps worst of all, it waits for us. For the agreement was never his alone. The contract, they say, was written in flesh. And flesh never forgets.